First of all, we are welcoming Edward Snowden on the screen, live from Moscow. Dear Edward Snowden, we are so proud that you are here tonight. You cannot see me now, but you will see Christian Borch in a few seconds. But we very much would like to underline that we are so sorry that you are not here in person. We promise you not to give in. We have, as you know, postponed the so-called Ossietzky Prize, the Freedom of Expression Ossietzky Prize of Norwegian PEN until the 7th of June next year, which is a symbolic and historic date in Norway. And a date we will really celebrate, and we are really hardworking to let that happen. You are so welcome to Norway. Thank you for being on the screen tonight. Christian Borch, please.
Thank you. Here we go. Yes, Edward Snowden, a hearty welcome to you. The auditorium is packed, as you can hear, with friends and admirers of your actions, your courage and your achievements, as you just heard, I suppose. We are, as William Nygaard said, eagerly looking forward to the ruling of the Supreme Court and to see you here in flesh and blood in June. In the meantime, I can tell you that you look perfectly all right, actually. Yeah, you do. Quite nice. So that it is. First, could I ask you to evaluate the effects of your revelations 3.5 years on, as you see them from your exile in Moscow today?
Yeah, I think this is a very complex question. We could talk about this for a long time, but in brief, it had a significant political effect, both inside the United States and outside it. Within the United States, there was a extreme wall of secrecy established by a succession of presidents, both President George Bush of the Iraq War and President Barack Obama, who continues it today, that this wall of secrecy had never been breached. But what it was protecting was the fact that within the United States, there were systems of mass surveillance that collected records about the private activities and communications of every American citizen, in many cases without a warrant, as well as their actual communications, details and without details, perfect records, with only the approval of a secret rubber stamp court that in 33 years only said no to the government 11 times. And that was out of about 34,000 requests. But more than that, it wasn't just about the effect on American citizens. For those of you in the room, anyone who doesn't hold a US passport or doesn't live in the United States with a green card, were considered to have no rights at all. There were no meaningful privacy protections that sheltered your life, that respected your rights, which meant, in effect, the NSA had created the world's first system of global mass surveillance. They collected everything about everyone that they could, simply because the technological capability was there. Since that time, the president who first came forward in June in response to the revelations and said he thought we had drawn the right balance between your rights and the government's desires. Therefore, there was nothing to discuss and we should all move on. But roughly 6 months later, courts that had been shut out of this discussion only 3 months earlier in the United States, 4 months earlier in the United States, reviewed the programs for the first time in a real court, not a secret court, an open court. And they found these programs were not only likely unconstitutional, violations of basic rights of Americans and those around the world, but they were unlawful and had been for the entirety of their operation, more than a decade. The Congress moved, with some protest, to reform some of these programs, not all of them, but the first significant reform bills in more than 40 years in the United States. And that president, who once defended these programs so rigorously, signed that bill into law, changing his position and saying, although he would never condone what I did, he felt that this debate had made us stronger as a nation. And on that point, I agree with him. Now, this debate echoed beyond the borders of the United States and has reached all other countries. I mean, this has been really discussed in a global way. But the sad result of it is when you have a wave of information that affects people's thinking, that gives them more power, more control over the direction of their society, more of a voice in saying how it is that they want to live and how the future should be, there is always a counter force, a backlash. And we see this coming from the intelligence communities, the spy agencies, of not just authoritarian states. New laws have been passed in countries like Russia, China, discussions, of course, held in countries like Iran, but also in the United Kingdom, which just this week passed the most extreme surveillance bill in the history of Western surveillance. In fact, many commentators and legal experts have said their bill is worse than the new Chinese surveillance bill. Germany has passed what it called reform laws that actually reduced the levels of rights that are enjoyed by German citizens and international individuals. The French have done the same, and in the United States, we see these same debates beginning again. And of course, we have now had a change of the presidency, which will complicate this even more. But this might give many people cause for fear. It might strike us as a moment of alarm, and it's true. This is a tipping point in the history of our rights. The boundaries of what we consider orthodoxies, of what it means to live in a free society, are being reshaped, often behind closed doors without our knowledge and consent. But we cannot fear, and we must not fear. We cannot hope for a hero to come forward and fix things. We cannot hope for a president or a legislator or anyone to stand up and save us. Because if anything, the history of the presidency of Barack Obama, who campaigned on platforms such as ending the very kind of mass surveillance that he embraced and extended, is that elected officials can and must be trusted as little as possible because campaign promises are not reliable. We can, of course, make decisions about who would better represent our interests based on their claims, but ultimately the hard work of defending democracy falls to people like you, the ones who are in this room right now. Don't be afraid, be ready, because the next years will be harder and full of more work, but more fulfilling work than we have seen in recent memory.
Yeah, well, my next question would be to quote the old saying that the people is the water in which the political fish are swimming, attributed to Mao Zedong, actually. But I mean, would you stress the importance of making people aware of these problems, being much more conscious about them, to do the actual pressure on the democratically elected politicians? Then, so I mean, how would you evaluate the broadening of the awareness of the great public?
Yeah, the difference is prior to 2013, if you said the government was collecting all of your emails, they were intercepting and storing vast databases of everything that you ever typed into the Google search box, every website that you ever visited, people would have thought that you were crazy. They would have asked you where your tinfoil hat was. These were claims that everyone knew were well, not everyone, but technical experts knew were possible in the theoretical sense, in the laboratory sense, but no one actually believed these things had been systematized and made normal, and they were happening right now. After 2013, we realized this isn't science fiction, this isn't fantasy, this is real life. These things are happening today. And that short distance between speculation and fact sometimes is all that matters in making people understand that these things will have an impact not just on the way you live, not just the measure of liberty or illiberalism within a society, but how your children will live. The road the world is walking down and the values that we were promoting, not just within our society, but setting up as an example to the rest of the world. And it can turn out that our bad behavior enables worse behavior from the worst and least responsible regimes on Earth.
Public opinion is fluctuating to a certain extent, and you have the problem that when people are afraid, they are doing other things than when they're not afraid, to put it very simply. And we have had a period of rather fierce terrorism. Does that jeopardize the efforts of understanding the necessity of a constitutional supported free trade principles? No, free speech principles, I mean.
I do think so. One of the things that is very clear today is how effective the politics of fear have become. You need to look only at any country, regardless of their language, regardless of their culture, to see that terrorism has become something of a legislative magic wand. As long as you say some bill is being passed to counter terrorists, in a place like Turkey, you can imprison journalists. You can march into a university and march out all of the professors you don't like and say that it's stabilizing society. And these policies will not jeopardize your administration. In many cases, it will make them more popular. In our own countries, where we have stronger constitutional protections, where we have acknowledgements of basic rights, particularly in the United States, values that we have not questioned for centuries suddenly become topics for debate, as long as you mention the word terrorism. So it is true that fear is effective, but this, as you imply, I would argue, only underlines the importance of constitutional protections, inabrogable guarantees of rights, unbreakable guarantees of rights that are not beholden to the passions of a current political moment, and are in fact very difficult to change or undermine. Because we need to think very carefully about how these basic fundamental concepts come to be born and why they're there. These don't come out of moments of political naivete. The founders of the US Constitution had literally been facing charges of treason. They had been, they were expecting to be hanged by a king in a faraway land that had imposed claims over them. These were individuals who were fighting a guerrilla war. They understood extremely well. One would argue they had a much greater appreciation for the deadliness of conflict than our current generation, who, despite anything we may say about the seriousness and advance of our understanding of politics and science, live in a relatively peaceful time. We do not have foreign troops on our shores. And yet, despite this, these individuals, when they were writing their constitution, were not trying to structure a strong government. They were not trying to structure an unlimited government. They were not trying to make the work of law enforcement officials and spies easy. Rather, they, on a uniform basis, were trying to specifically engineer mechanisms to make the work of government more difficult, because they recognized that this would make the state of society more free. And this is the same thing that we saw in the birth of sort of our new system of international law, recognition of international human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, coming out of the United Nations. These are the kind of thing that were coming out of periods of world wars. The greatest periods of conflict that we have ever witnessed. These were not naive individuals. These were not reactionaries. These were people who were facing true existential threats, not a few isolated individuals who are embracing violence and extremism and radicalism because they feel like they're unheard and therefore responding to criminal tactics. Terrorism is a true threat, but it is not an existential one. The only thing that can undermine our societies in the context of terrorism, the only thing that can bring down a liberal democracy, an open society, in response to a few individuals embracing heinous methods of criminal violence, are our own mistakes. The only thing that can close our society, the only thing that can limit our rights, is a failure of our own political foresight.
I suppose it's an aim to increase the awareness all over the democratic world in a way, not only in the United States. What effect would you see that these principles were anchored more firmly in international law? I'm thinking both about protection of whistleblowers and the principles of against mass surveillance.
Yeah, we have seen a lot of discussion about this, and it's become quite clear that within the national context, there are no meaningful whistleblower protection laws practically anywhere. What I mean to say is, if you have a Swiss whistleblower that embarrasses the Swiss government, that government will respond and retaliate, and in fact has, we have seen in certain cases, in ways that are extreme, in ways that are unjustifiable. The same for France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, the United States. We need an international system to mitigate those failures of comprehending the natural human response of wanting to retaliate against us, or wanting to retaliate against those who have embarrassed us, regardless of whether what they did was right or wrong. And we do see, I think, the beginning of some international recognition as to we do see some recognition of these political realities, where members of European Parliament recently voted to pass a resolution claiming that whistleblowers should be protected. This vote was not strictly about myself, although they invoked my name. What they were saying was that within the European Union, we need to recognize that the only way we will enjoy the benefits of truth tellers in a free and open society is if we do not require them to be destroyed as a result of telling the truth. And that vote barely passed, but it did pass. And so I hope that we'll see more progress in those directions toward the future.
Is the technological development creating new challenges in this field all the time? I mean, it's getting so fast, it's difficult for people to follow it. I'm reflecting to my own lack of ability to understand what's going on, actually. But you do have things like social hacking. I mean, going into open social podcasts and that sort of thing, and doing things which are theoretically not illegal, but which can amount to something which is against the principles of freedom of speech or surveillance.
Yeah, the idea, I think, behind this is that technology is revealing to us properties that we did not foresee, that we did not expect, in a way that many sciences have gone through in the past. In the last century, we had nuclear physicists who dreamed about creating clean energy, free energy, and of course, they unlocked the secrets of the atom. And yet, these nuclear physics also gave rise to vast amounts of nuclear material that became radioactive, accidents, and of course, nuclear weapons. We today are living through the atomic moment of computer science as a discipline. Technologies and devices, services, and companies that we intended to empower individuals and communities around the world are being undermined are being corrupted in new ways, in many cases secret ways, to disempower those same communities. And we haven't yet got a handle on how we control for those new kinds of radioactive waste. And this, in our case, are the records, the transactions that are occurring instantly right now as we have this communication, not just as we give this talk, but as you sit in this room. All of your cell phones that are in your pocket are singing out into the sky, into the air, saying, "Here I am," so they can register with the phone company and give them a record that you are here in this moment, not so they can spy on you. That was not the intention. But so they can make sure when somebody calls your phone, they know which cell phone tower, wherever it is in the world, is the one close to you, so they can actually have you pick up that phone. They can send you that call notification. You can answer it and be in contact with your family. But until we change that, until we recognize that these capabilities that were intended to provide a useful function can be used to actually subjugate us, they can be used to limit our participation and weaken our level of influence relative not just to governments, but private powers, corporate powers, we will always struggle with ensuring that technology actually does provide more of a boon than a bane to our societies.
Talking about social media, you have 2.5 million followers on Twitter, and you are lecturing at several universities through Skype, and you're giving interviews for international audiences like you do today. What could you say about your sort of interaction with the people who follow you and have the same ideas as you? Is it good, open, or is it encouraging?
It is. I mean, this is one of the surprising things was, look, I don't think it's controversial to say the United States government is the most powerful government in the history of the world. We have never seen a state with this much influence, with this much control, not just in raw military terms, but over the way we think, over the debates we have, over the arguments politically or commercially that we consider to be reasonable. They shape our culture. And yet, despite the fact that my government, rightly or wrongly, considers me to be a fugitive for an act of dissidence, and has run a fairly ceaseless campaign of sort of criticism and trying to get Americans and people around the world to see me as a terrible individual, we still have this extraordinary mass of individuals, whether they're at universities or whether they're on the internet, that wants to hear that dissident view. They want to hear the disagreement. They want to hear something that is rather outside the orthodox. And this is actually the greatest seed of all of my hope, is the fact that as long as we have even small groups of committed individuals around the world, regardless of where they live, who want to hear the other side, who want to find the facts, who want to listen to all views and weigh for themselves, make their own decision of who they are, who they want to become, and how they want to shape the world, we have the foundation of a participatory process that is not about power. It's not about who you are, but it's about the kind of ideas that you can present, to have a civil discussion, to have a war that is not fought with tanks and bombs and boots, but is one with pens and papers, with keyboards and messages, and build bonds of fraternity between human hearts that may not speak the same language, but do recognize that we all can respond to the same things.
This might sound as a leading question, but nevertheless, in that respect, I mean, how important is international support, concrete actions you see internationally, like the PEN, Norwegian PEN, awarding you the Ossietzky Prize? Was that the leading question? Yeah.
It's a little bit leading, but I think it's a fair question, right? And it's a good point, which is, in my country, at home, in the United States, it was fashionable to condemn me. Under the new president, as the news today says, the new CIA director is an individual who believes that dissidents, such as myself, should be put to death. They think that that is the appropriate resolution to disagreeing with the government. Now, this was what people were expected to say in that moment in 2013, if they were part of sort of the government establishment. But that's beginning to change. And I think a lot of that comes from, as we say, when we step out of that raw national context, where you have sort of social obligations to present a kind of patriotism or nationalism unthinkingly, without considering sort of what this really means for society. You get a better quality of conversation. You get people saying, well, let's look at this in a more considered way, rather than what we're expected to say, what the orthodoxy is again. And Europe, particularly Western Europe, has been quite good about having these conversations in a way that's not just for show, it's not just political, but it's actually persuading individuals, not just in Europe, but around the world and in the United States. And that's the reason why I think in 2013, it was commonplace to say, this guy's a terrible individual, this is going to cause great harm to the nation, the sky is going to fall, the oceans are going to boil off, the land is going to catch fire. But here in 2016, nobody makes those same claims anymore. They're seen as silly or unserious. And the way that we change those opinions, the way that I guess our minds are opened, even when they're closed off by expectation or obligation, is through organizations such as PEN. Ultimately, I would say the only thing that can really shift our political understandings, not just across cultures and languages, but times, right? To create that truly classic ideal that persists long after even nations disappear, are our words.
Edward Snowden, thank you for your very open and very reflective way of answering our questions. It's been good to have you here, and we're indeed looking forward to seeing you here next year. In the meantime, good luck with absolutely everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.